So oxides are essentially metals, and what we have is a metal pigment ground down and suspended in water. If you hold one up to the light, in here you can see the sediment, the weighty sediment at the bottom, the black, and then you can see the water. This has not been used recently, so the sediment has fallen to the bottom. Now these chemicals look different when they've been fired. So this one is cobalt carbonate. If we have a look at the colour of it, it kind of looks like a kind of dusty, dirty grey colour, but when it's fired, it turns into this blue colour because of the chemical reaction that's occurred. This is one where the blue has then had some glaze applied, a white glaze over the top, so it's got quite a beautiful finish to it. Let's look at those two things side by side. So where it's not glazed, it's not shiny. Where there is glaze on it, it's become shiny. The glaze is like a powder glass that then melts in the kiln. This one is black iron oxide, and here we have a red iron oxide, which comes out as a slightly browner colour. All our chemicals, stains, oxides and glaze are kept in this yellow cosh cupboard in the main pottery. It says very specifically on it, you must not access any of this without gloves. If there are other specific requirements, the member of staff that's training you will talk you through those requirements. You must not access this cupboard without permission. So remember, we fire work in a kiln. So we have the wet clay that you've been working on, the green ware, that's then dried out and taken up to very high temperatures, over 1,000 degrees usually, and it bakes in this kiln. So when the clay has been through the kiln, it has been biscuit fired, and it's at this stage where if we drop it now, it will smash. We can't reconstitute it again. To decorate with oxides, we go back into the kiln. So we apply them to the surface, and then we'll put them back in the kiln and fire them. They will bond into the surface of the clay. This piece allows us to really see what oxides can do. The oxide has been painted on, and see how it's sat into those indented, imprinted low relief surfaces. I would think a biro perhaps has been pressed into this to make those marks, and then the oxide's been applied. It's been wiped off the surface and it sits in the grooves. Now oxide is perfect for this, to go into those low areas. It will stay in the overall surface of the clay if left on the surface, but it works quite nicely. You see it's staying there with the cobalt. It works nicely where it picks out that detail and emphasises those low relief areas. So here comes the demonstration, and the first thing I must do, of course, health and safety. Pop on the gloves. Now I'm going to be doing this in a very controlled way. There'll be no splashing, so I do not need eye protection. Got the gloves on. The gloves will be provided for you. Now I'm going to work onto one of these little biscuit fire tiles. You can tell they're biscuit fired. And like I say, there's different ways to do this, but the way we're going to do it is the way we tend to in this project at school. So I'm moving everything else out of the way. And I'm going to open my cobalt carbonate. Now these are decanted, that's why they're labelled like such. They don't have any other health and safety information on them, and they are stored in the metal cupboard. We have all the risk assessments and the cost sheets separately. So notice what I'm doing, I'm mixing. I don't have a lot of water in here, I'm not going to splash anything around in there, just mixing and checking there isn't a thick sediment at the bottom. So I'm going to lift this up and I'm going to paint it like a heavy paint, and I'm trying to just fill those low relief areas. So sometimes you get a little air pocket in them. Do you see there's little air pockets occurring? I might have to go over it 1 or 2 times and check it's gone into the grooves. Now pottery brushes, we can handle them in a slightly different way than painting brushes, because it's less important that we try and protect those bristles for controlled work. You see how I'm dabbing in? We wouldn't do that if we were doing painting. So I've covered the whole surface. In this case, I'm going to cover the edge as well, so I'm consistent. Now if that goes in the kiln, it's got a very thick coat on it, and it's quite powdery on its upper surface. So what I want to do is I want to wash it off. So we give you a bowl of water, sometimes like a sink bowl, and a little sponge, and you soak the sponge and then you squeeze most of the water out of it, and then you wipe it. You see what's just occurred? So you can see as I'm wiping it, I'm taking it off the top surface. Now there's a little bit of staining on that top surface, and that will mean it will come out a reasonable blue colour. If I want it to be lighter, I will just sponge a little bit more. I certainly want it to stay in those grooves. So just going around the edge, just cleaning up. Now if my sponge is a bit dirty, I can just rinse it out. For the purposes of the video, I've got another sponge to hand. So that is the first piece that I've done. Quite straightforward, quite simple. Now I could apply glaze to this to make it shiny, or I could just leave it as it is. So in the next demonstration, I have in front of me a little ceramic fox tile that I've made. And this time I'm going to be using the red iron oxide, because obviously I think it would be better for the subject matter. So I'm going to just pop my little fox out of the way, and I'm going to pick up the oxide. And remember, there's the sediment at the bottom. You can see it quite thick as I've lifted it up, but that needs to be suspended in the water. And again, we don't put a lot of water in here, less chance of splashing in this deep container. And mixing it all up. Now this has less in the way of surface texture, so I'm just going to go into the surface, and it's going on much easier than it did on my last example. Go around the edges again. Now I could leave some areas white, but what I'm actually going to do is put the oxide over the whole surface and then later polish it off, clean it up. Making sure I've done the edges. You know what I'm like, I like attention to detail. If we're going to do something, we do it properly. So I've made sure all those edges are nicely done. I don't need to do the back. So I'll take my small sponge again, squeeze the water out of it, and rub it off. Now you see where those indentations are, where those shadowy areas are. Do you see how it's holding the oxide more? So if I want to take a bit more out, I can work into it with a little bit more. So there I've brushed him off, and I might add a little bit of black just onto the tip of his nose and into his eyes. So I have the black, I've mixed it up, and this time I'm using a much finer brush because I'm just going to paint a little tip onto the nose in a much more controlled way than I was previously. I'm going to put a little bit of black onto those eyes. Now I don't want to add it all over, I just want to work the little eyeball into the centre. That's me done. So I've applied the oxide to 3 different tiles. This one is the black, this one is the one that will be red, and this is the one that's blue. So remember what I've said about the colours will change. Now you can apply a little bit of glaze. You've got to make sure you've got the right type of glaze. It's not always worth speaking to a member of staff or Chrissy. This is a white glaze, and this is this Pottery Crafts white glaze, and it's super for this type of work. If it isn't fired to the right temperature, it under fires. See how this one is actually matte and not shiny like a glass on the white area. But this one, if I hold it close, hopefully you can see it's just shining on that surface. The sun has come out perfectly to illustrate it. So the glaze has been mixed, and what I'm going to do is I've got a small amount on the surface of the brush, and I'm just going to paint onto the top surface. I'm not going to go over the sides. If it goes onto the base, we end up with a little bit of a problem because it could stick to the kiln shelf. Now you'd ideally need a minimum of 2 coats on this. So I didn't scoop out a big load of it and splodge it on into all my grooves. I'm going to let my grooves stay quite matte. So I'm going to do a second coat. Because it's porous, it absorbs the water really quickly. So I'm just slowly painting it on. The second coat, obviously it's slightly damp, it won't absorb it quite as quickly. So as well as glaze the surface of this tile, this cobalt tile, I've done a little bit of finer work onto this fox, and I've painted very carefully with a small brush around these sections, obviously using a small brush so I can get into those areas. I've put 2 to 3 coats on there. Now all this work is going to go to be fired again, so it needs to dry out, and then it's going to go into the kiln. At this point, I need to take my brushes to the sink, contain all the chemicals that I've been using and put them in the correct place in the health and safety cupboard, and then wash all surfaces before I remove my gloves.
Hi guys, so all of these have now been through the kiln again on the stoneware firing. So this one has no surface on it at all, no change, no additional features. And if we look at it against the original disc, notice how much smaller it is, about 10%. So it reduces in scale again when fired. Now this one is the black iron oxide, still quite dark, stained deep into those grooves, into the surface imprint. The red iron oxide is a slightly brown colour, and if you see here, it's the one with the glaze on top of it. So you can see the white glaze on top of the surface there, but not into the grooves very much. This is the blue cobalt carbonate, and it's quite a nice colour, quite like a Prussian blue. And then if we look at this one, we can see little dots of white glaze. Can you just see those on there? So I've put it on the local areas. And this one, I've put the glaze all over. And it does change the colour quite significantly. Notice it's kind of like a more French ultramarine blue than it is over here, where I say it's a bit more Prussian blue. So it's quite a significant change. And doing little samples like this is really, really useful before you apply them to your work. But here are some little tiles that I've made. This is the red iron oxide with a clear glaze. Notice how the oxide has run into the clear glaze, so you don't get really clear sections around those eyes. It kind of bleeds out a little bit. But this one had red iron oxide under it. It has the white glaze painted on top, and then a little bit of the black iron oxide, just a little teeny bit onto the nose and into the eyes. So he's worked out quite well, like a little polar. And here I've made a little foxtail, and we've got red iron oxide, white glaze on top of it, and again a teeny weeny little bit of black iron oxide onto the eyes. Sampling is always worthwhile, and these kinds of things are great for sketchbooks later on in your school career. But if you ever want to have a little look at something, we've got plenty of examples around the department.